No, thank you so much, Meg. I'm very excited to be here and honored to be part of the conversation. I think you covered most of the things I would want people to know. Thank
All
you.
right. Just quick, because I didn't get a chance to talk to you earlier. Do you prefer Rob, Robert, RC? What would you prefer?
RC is what most people call me, so that's fine.
Excellent. All right. So for my first question, um, 80% of LGBTQIA plus talent are comfortable being out at work, which sounds amazing, but that's up 36% since 2016. Now, given that significant increase, what do you think might have been the key drivers of this progress?
I love this question because I had to stop and think about it myself about where was I mentally in 2015 and was I comfortable being out at work? I think there's a couple of things. I think it comes down to exposure, but I think also the shift in society and particularly the United States around legality. So I think about like Obergefell in 2015, and it really brought the conversation to the surface. And I remember reading the decision from the Supreme Court and how it talked about the right to that dignity of marriage. And putting that in the spotlight, I think, helped shift the conversation faster. It was already moving quickly. And
Mhm.
then I think in 2020, when the Supreme Court ruled on the Civil Rights Act and Title VII actually applying to gender identity as well as sexual orientation as protected characteristics in employment, I think those drive and awareness, I think that allows people to say, okay, I can be out because there are some protections that exist for me.
Mhm.
So there's maybe a little bit more courage to say, I'm going to go out there because I know that there's something to fall back on in a worst case scenario. But the second part, I think, is that exposure piece. I think it can't hurt that we had an out gay presidential candidate who was actually
Mhm.
a viable candidate, who was open about his loving marriage to his husband, right? And has a place in the cabinet, right? So there is something, that age-old saying, if you can see it, you can be it. And I think there is just as the passage of time occurs, there are more people to look at and say, oh, they're out, they're doing okay, they have a successful career, they have relationships at work, it's going to be okay, and it gives people that courage. So those are the things that really, come to mind. um, and then just time marches on and things adjust, and so I think there's been a rapid shift in perception in this particular area. With some areas we still need a lot of work to do, obviously. But, I did a little digging, and like of the Fortune 500, 91% of the Fortune 500 companies prohibit discrimination based on sex and sexual orientation, and 83% on gender identity. And that's up from 3 in 2000, according to the Human Rights Campaign. So even just, corporations actually making adjustments to their policies, again, it exposes people and maybe causes some dialogue and some thinking where people say, okay, and then that slowly trickles down and creates the courage to come out and be comfortable coming out at work.
Yeah, I mean, I would 100% agree with that. It reminds me a lot of things like cannabis legalization, where if your skin is a certain color and you make a certain amount of money, a lot of things have never really been illegal for you, right? Like, yes, these things are illegal, but the idea or the risk of you suffering any real consequences is greatly reduced. And
Right.
I think that also very hugely applies here because what you're seeing now, I believe, is that the normalization of it has trickled down. Like you said, having that protection in place. A lot of people are not resourced enough to be able to make these decisions and to kind of, it's not even voting your politics, but like work for companies that are ethically, in line with what they want. Even companies that are have the right values and morals and stuff, they still might not be walking the walk when it really comes to things like acceptance in the workforce. And so I do agree what we're seeing now, the fact that there are so many more people that feel comfortable, I think the protections angle is massive in this, absolutely huge.
Yeah, I think it really does make a difference for people because of that resourcing comment, right? If you have intersectionality, right, and you belong to multiple marginalization groups, right, you're in a situation where those protections don't always exist, but to know that they're built in and they're legally ruled upon and, cannot be argued, is really important. And I think, you know, I was reading on the Williams Institute at the UCLA. I like some of what they do. And they were saying that there are still 3.9 million American LGBTQ plus IA people who live in states where it is not explicitly prohibited to discriminate on sexual orientation or gender identity. And so it can be argued in those states. Of course, we have the national law to help, but I imagine if you were to look at those specific states in that survey, you might get a very different response.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like any stats at all, numbers can say whatever you want them to say, however you want to cut and splice them. So
Right.
I think it is really important that we don't just look at stats, we look at the stories behind them. Um, do you think that there are any specific strategies or initiatives that companies could implement if they are trying to support their alphabet mafia coworkers into bringing their whole selves to work?
I really love that. The alphabet mafia. I
I
like that.
trip over the letters every time, so I keep throwing it in there, but like I gotta change it up a little bit.
Yeah, I get that. I think I just said plus and then the IA after when we just spoke. So I hear you and understand that. I think, you know, the obvious ones are ERGs, corporate sponsorship, right? I think that's maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but that feels like the low-hanging fruit that every organization could do, right? It's about creating space for people to be their authentic selves, having a welcoming mat for them to come and be themselves. Whether they take you up on it is up to them, but the space being there, I think, is really important. But then I think there are the second layer down. I think if you excavate a little bit deeper, which is, you know, inclusive leadership training. So really talking to people about what is inclusive leadership. You know, it's not making sure that when everybody goes to the bar after work that everyone's invited, right? It's about making sure that when those people go to the bar that you're asking about everyone's spouse and not just the people who are, you know, cisgender and heterosexual, right? And really inviting that conversation. If you're going to talk about relationships, you're talking about it with everyone.
Mhm.
Um, and then I think allyship training is the other side of that, right? So everyone is an ally and has the potential to be an ally. And it's about really teaching people how do you actively do allyship. So,
Mhm.
you know, at our organization, we have our DEI team, and one of my colleagues created a really fantastic allyship training program that is low commitment in the sense it doesn't take a lot of time, but it's very, very effective. And people come out with real tools on how to be allies, and you can see the shift happen. And I think that's what happens is that organizations assume that people know how to do these things. And so sometimes they think it's just about the basics, you know, even as a member of the alphabet mafia, as you call it. I find that I am always learning. And I took that workshop and I was like, yep, there are things I had forgotten or things I never really had words for to think about how would I handle that situation. So I think those are things that people can do. And I think you know, it's such a great question and one I hear a lot. And I think sometimes people expect me to say these big initiatives, right? But I think sometimes it's the smaller, intimate moments with a conversation that can really make or break the experience for people. So an example I have is, you know, I'm married to a man, and you know, I've had leaders in this business, very senior leaders. How's your husband? How are things? Like, how's your house hunt going and things like that. That is probably going to go further for me than anything else they could do because I feel seen, right? I feel like the wholeness of myself is available to them and they're saying, you're welcome here. Let me ask about you in the way that they would any other employee. And so, you know, if there's anything I can say about this particular thing is that I don't think organizations have to aim for the moon. I think that some very simple tweaks in how we talk to one another and talk about allyship and leadership can make a whole world of difference.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's talk a little bit more about your experience in particular. Could you share any personal experiences or stories from your career that highlight that importance of authenticity and inclusion in the workplace?
Yeah, I started my career in retail. You know, you got to pay your student loan bills.
Oh, heck yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we all know. And you know, started in retail, and it's really interesting because retail has a fair mix of the LGBTQIA plus community in it, but then there can also be some really not open-minded people in that space. So you really have to navigate, is the word that comes to mind, and kind of read the room and know who's an ally, who may not be, who you're not sure about. And it's absolutely exhausting. And you're exhausted by it. Because you think some people know, but do those people know? And is it a big deal if I tell them? And all of the mental gymnastics you have to go through on a daily basis. And I remember that. And then I moved into the more you kind of white collar space, I guess you would call it, colloquially. And even there were still a lot of mental gymnastics in some of my earlier career. And again, exhausting, right? And you feel a weight on your shoulders, and you're not sure where to step. Step on
Mhm.
a crack, you break your mother's back. It's kind of like step on a crack, your career is over. So be careful,
Right? Yeah.
and it feels that dire at times, because you don't know. And then I think about the organization I'm in. I've been here 7.5 years, and the difference of being seen and getting those questions about your spouse and about what are you doing this weekend? Oh, it's Pride. Are you doing anything for Pride? Questions like that really do make a huge difference, in the sense that over time, I hate the word normalization, but it just becomes less of a thing because you just are who you are.
Mhm.
And you become part of the conversation. And this characteristic of you is not the defining characteristic. It's about your work. It's about your contribution to the culture. And so the days that you don't feel like the one who wants to be the representative, you don't have to be, right? You can take a break. But the days that you do, you can do that too. And there's space for both pieces in there. So my experience has been good in a lot of places. I had some great experiences early in my career where the organization allowed my then domestic partner, now husband, to be on my insurance, which felt revolutionary at the time, to think we're not married, but you're progressive enough sort of in your policies that you're going to allow this to happen, and how that made me feel. And I felt empowered to be a little more authentic at work. And I think it's very hard to bring your best performance at work if you cannot bring yourself to work.
Mhm.
And if there's always a part of you that's kind of closed off, hidden, or cordoned off, right? You end up in a situation where you don't have access to maybe the magic that that section of you can bring, right? And so I think you have to be able to bring every part of yourself to work to be able to access all of your potential at work. And it's really been my experience that when that happens, you can feel it. It's very hard to describe. You don't always know it, but you can feel it.
Mhm.
You can't point to a thing and be like, that's the thing that made all the difference, but you can feel the shift internally, like the compass, like you turn due north, right? And okay, it feels authentic. I'm myself. I am aligned with the internal vision of myself and the external are the same, right?
Yeah.
And the people I'm speaking to see me in that way as well.
I think that's wonderful. Now I think you're probably among like-minded individuals or people of similar similar backgrounds, people who have also at one point or another felt like they had to hide part or a lot of themselves in the workplace. So if y'all are in the audience today and that is not your experience, or you don't have any context for that, first of all, love that for you. No one should have to hide who they are in the workplace. But I think it can be either unfamiliar or overwhelming for people who've not had that lived experience to imagine what that is like. And you're right. I mean, it extends to everything because, like, how often do you overhear straight people in the office, cisgender or heterosexual or both, talking about like, oh yeah, and we went to Home Depot with the kids this weekend, and they went to a birthday party, and then we went out on date night, and that was kind of the whole weekend. And there's three instances in that one sentence about one weekend that if you are out and proud in the workplace, depending on where you are, either like work-wise, industry-wise, or location in the country, that it could be really difficult and really dangerous to say stuff like that.
Right.
And you're right. I mean, just the mental gymnastics alone, like what have I shared with them? What haven't I shared? Is this okay to share? I don't really know. There's not really like you just kind of got to take the leap and hope for the best.
Right.
Um, do you think that there have been any times where you realized in the moment that it was not going to be okay for you to share?
Yeah, there was one experience I had when I first moved to New York. And I had moved past internships into sort of full-time work. I don't want to say the name of the organization, but it was earlier in my New York career. And I had was speaking to someone in the finance department, and they were talking about their weekend actually with their wife and their two children. And he said, "What about you? What did you do this week?" And I said, "Well, my husband and I, XYZ." I might have said partner at that time. "Oh, you have a partner?" And it felt all of a sudden like the shift was just, you felt the pit of my stomach drop out, and you're like, "Oh, oh, did I say something I'm not supposed to?" But then also sort of like some belligerence builds up, like, why should I have to feel this way about this? Right. And so you're in this strange dynamic where you are hopefully emotionally intelligent enough to know, like, I need to be careful here. I'm reading the room. I understand there is risk, but also this argument you're having internally about, like, but why should you have to? You shouldn't have to hide this. And so again, the mental gymnastics and the tax on you is huge. The mental strain of it. And our
Well, you don't
relationship.
even have to be afraid you're going to lose your job, right? You could just I say just, but you could just be afraid that, Tammy in accounting is not going to be very nice to you. And now you're going to have to jump through hoops to get what you need from Tammy, which is a function of your job. So, yeah,
Exactly. Exactly. And that was more of the sensation in that meeting than any fear of losing my job, because I knew my boss was a big ally. I knew all of that, right? And what happened was that it wasn't the same ever again. Things that this person used to come to me for didn't come to me anymore, right? Would go to someone else. And it was noticeable and it was painful. I would love to say, oh, I brushed it off. Yeah, but it really is painful.
of course.
And I think of, my trans friends, right? Brothers and sisters, right? And the experience they're having in the environment that we're in right now, and having to live that, right? It feels, I know the pain. I don't know that particular pain, but I know that sensation of risk calculation, and concern about the job, perhaps, but even just the dynamic of your relationship, right?
Mhm.
How it shifts. And it could be someone that you really like and really respect, and they surprise you, and then so it's mixed in with disappointment as well.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
You had talked about your boss at the time being a very strong ally.
Mhm.
What role do you think ally and leadership can play when it comes to fostering this inclusive environment? How important do you think it is? How influential?
I think it's hugely influential. I think it's hugely influential. And, I'll go back to that example in that particular case of that manager, was someone who did say, how is my husband's name is Dan. So I was trying to think of a pseudonym. His name is Dan. How's Dan doing, right? On a Monday? Did you and Dan do anything fun in front of other people? Right. And so
Mhm.
it creates this modeling of, this is a normal dialogue. This is not something you should be afraid to ask about. Let's just talk about it. Um, and would also celebrate my wins in the same way that she celebrated the wins of others. And would advocate for me in the way that she would advocate for others. And doing it publicly, I think, had a huge impact because it sets the tone. There is, in the concept of group dynamics and everything, there is this concept of authority, right? And you get positional authority, but you also have the authority of just your person, right? And she had positional authority and also was incredibly charismatic and smart and charming. And so the combination of the two, she was really able to set the table in a lot of way for inclusivity. But I think there's practical things that leaderships needs to do as well, and allies need to do. I mean, all leaders are allies, right? So, that's the thing, is we are all allies, have the potential to be allies. But I think allies, it's this displaying symbols of support, either verbally or just even a flag on your desk during Pride Month, right? Or talking about your sibling who may be part of the, alphabet mafia. I am going to use that. I really
It's
appreciate
fun.
that.
I'm telling you,
It's
keep it
fun. It kind
fun.
of is. It's great. It's great. But those are little moments of allyship that, again, it doesn't have to be a grand gesture, but saying, oh, my brother and his boyfriend, or my sister, right?
Mhm.
And those types of things really invite people in and make it feel like, okay, I can bring all of that. It's safe to do so. Um, and I think allies also have a duty to spread awareness, and I'm not talking about like they need to go speak on a panel or be on a symposium or do a big social media post about it. But, it is when you're in a conversation with your friends, right? And they have questions about something that you have learned about through your own self-education or relationships, to speak in that moment to your experience as an ally, right? And spread that knowledge. And then on the leadership side, it really is about at work in particular, inclusive policies. That's work that we've done here at MIQ a lot is, are our policies truly inclusive? Are our practices truly inclusive? How are our benefits doing, right? Are we making sure that our benefits actually provide a truly inclusive experience for people? And are we being allies by not just talking about by being allies, but are we doing things that support that? Obviously, promoting, sponsoring ERGs and promoting open communication, I think, is part of it too, is allowing people to say, okay, I really loved what you were trying to do there, didn't quite hit the mark, right? Can we talk about that? I think that creates those open dialogues that really open things up.
I like how you dialed in a little bit on the separation, but also like kind of the interconnectedness of leadership, right? You can lead from a place of authority, you can lead from a place of social clout. There's a lot of different ways that you can do that. And I think this is also potentially where allies get tripped up when it comes to active and like verb, like the allyship as a verb, but then also you kind of get into this like virtue signaling area, and it can get really muddy really quickly. But as long as what you're, especially if you are from an allyship group as opposed to from that demographic, like you have to use this. You have to use that social capital that you have. I mean, like I said, like there's certain things that have always been legal because you had the money to pay for the fines if you were a certain color or from a certain tax bracket.
Correct.
And so, like the front of our house looks like a rainbow threw up on it. And it is not because I am LGBTQIA plus. It's not because I have people in my family who are, which is true. Like, but it's because I have a certain amount of social capital. And if seeing those flags out front makes even one person feel more safe in our neighborhood, that's
Yes.
something I want to encourage.
Yes.
Throw rocks at my house all day if you want to. I don't care. Like those flags stay up. And
Yep.
that's, it is about setting that example, being visible if you are safe and able to, that can make the difference for so many other people who maybe did not feel okay to speak up, did not feel okay to talk about themselves or to ask questions about, the kind of support that they actually need.
100%. I think, that is the responsibility, I think, of leadership in a lot of ways. Understanding your organization's values and then living those values. And if allyship and inclusivity is one of the values, then, you have an obligation in your role. And I think then there is even the more senior level of leadership that if you're not seeing that behavior, then it is, you're beholden to take action, right? And make sure that they are the very least not acting counter to the values, right? I think that's an important part of the consideration as well. But I think you bring up a good point, which is allyship within the community as well. So I think sometimes there is an assumption that we're all allies for one another, but I think, that's not always the case. And I think that there's still education that needs to be done in certain parts of our community around what it means to be trans, right? Intersex, all of that. And we have work to do there as well. We cannot simply say, oh, okay, well, these so, socially we're accepted now, we're good. No, there's always work to be done to support others and help others, get that same ability to be themselves, fully live their life out in the open.
I think you make a really good point there about transness and trans visibility because, a lot of people, certainly my parents, their first and only interaction for a very long time with any degree of transness was Caitlyn Jenner. Now, for better or for worse, there's a lot of topics to discuss under that, but that's not representative of most trans women's identity or their journey. And so kind of I've had conversations with my parents about everything from passing and what that actually means, to the fact that that may or may not be a goal for most people. That, you know, there are people that don't wish to be seen in the binary at all. And so I think you're right. You know, we have to normalize these conversations so that people don't feel stupid asking, they don't feel like it's a taboo subject, right? We saw this a ton in 2020 when there were vast swaths of the BIPOC community that wanted to be called Black instead of African American. And a
Yeah.
ton of white people were very uncomfortable with this because for a very long time, being called Black was a slur. They've said
Right.
it in negative capacities and are not understanding that no, it's an identity that people are claiming. That's what they want you to call them. So that's what you call them.
Right.
So I'm muddling the subject here a ton, but like it really, I do see it all kind of intersecting there. All right, looking ahead, what do you think are the biggest challenges and opportunities if people want to continue to improve the workplace experience for LGBTQIA employees?
Yes, no, I think it's a great question. I think one of the things that come is more and more companies are international, right? And multinational. And so I think one big challenge is how do you live your value of inclusivity as an organization and in your life when there's so much global variability?
Mhm.
So there are countries we're talking about LGBTQIA plus identity is illegal, right? Or there are severe consequences if you are identified as such. And so I think that's something, the legal barriers, the cultural differences, how do you create policies and procedures that are as inclusive as they can be within the law, right, of the regions that you're in. I think intersectionality, we've talked a little bit about, but the idea of the multiple marginalization, right? How do you target your allyship and your focus at those individuals? Because it's not the same, right? I will speak, I'm a cisgender white gay man, right? For the past few years, things have been okay for me, right? So like, it's really important not to like say, okay, he's the representative, and so we're going to aim our allyship and our work in diversity towards him. It's actually, okay, let's think about the complexity of intersectionality. How do we create allyship that meets that need? Right. And again, not always having just the white and male cisgender lens, right? How do we do that? So I think that's a challenge and an opportunity, I think. Um, Underrepresentation in leadership, I think, is one that, every group can talk about, but I think, Tim Cook is the exception, right? Tim Cook as a out gay male running a multi-billion-dollar and trillion-dollar company, depending on the day, right, is the exception to the rule. And we need to see more so that we can see that. And then getting too comfortable, I think, is a challenge. Too comfortable to say the work is done. We've done what
Yeah.
we need to do. The work is not done. It is never done. And when we're not talking about it anymore because there's nothing to talk about, that's when it's done, right? And then I
Well,
think
we're
the
a long
opportunity,
way from that.
we are exactly, and so, I think we all need to remind ourselves that the work isn't done. And I think the opportunities are continuous learning, right? We all have an opportunity to just keep learning and keep educating and keep having conversations. I think trans and non-binary inclusion is a huge opportunity. I don't hear about it as much as I think we should be talking about it. And I put myself in that category. I don't talk about it enough. I think it's one of those ones that we all have work to do on that area. Representation and leadership, again, a challenge, but also an opportunity. I think there are opportunities for us. And then I think inclusive innovation. So I think, the world of innovation, which MIQ does a lot of innovation, is how are we making sure that the LGBTQIA plus community is part of that innovation conversation? Uh,
Mhm.
because it's important. I think it's an important part of it. We all know the more diverse thinking you can bring to an idea, the better outcomes you're going to get. Let's make sure those voices are part of that conversation.
Ugh. Y'all, I don't have anything that I can say that's going to put it better than that. So, RC, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I have loved getting to learn from you for the last half hour. Thank you so much for your time. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was really great to speak to you.